The morning mist clung to the red clay hills surrounding Sanh combat base like a death shroud, and Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was January 20th, 1968, and the silence in the demilitarized zone had become unnaturally heavy, broken only by the distant rumble of supply helicopters struggling through the fog. Rodriguez adjusted his flak jacket and peered through the perimeter wire at the jungle beyond. The 26th Marine Regiment had been stationed at this remote outpost, near the North Vietnamese border for months, but lately, intelligence reports spoke of massive troop movements in the surrounding hills. The base, strategically positioned to monitor the Ho Chi Minh Trail, had become increasingly isolated as enemy forces seemed to materialize from the very earth itself. Colonel David Lones, commanding officer of the 26th Marines, stood in the command bunker reviewing the latest reconnaissance reports. The numbers were staggering. Estimates suggested that 2 full North Vietnamese Army divisions, perhaps 20,000 troops, had taken positions in the mountains surrounding the base. According to contemporary military analysis from Time magazine's coverage of the siege, this represented one of the largest concentrations of enemy forces seen during the Vietnam conflict. The base itself was a modest collection of bunkers, trenches, and supply depots carved into a plateau roughly 600 meters long and 400 meters wide. 6,000 Marines called this desolate patch of earth home, supported by a South Vietnamese Army Ranger Battalion. The airstrip, vital for resupply and evacuation, lay exposed to enemy observation from the surrounding high ground, a tactical nightmare that kept every Marine awake at night. Captain James Wilkinson of Bravo Company walked the perimeter, checking his men's positions as the fog began to lift. His Marines had spent weeks reinforcing their positions, digging deeper bunkers and laying additional wire obstacles. But everyone knew that if the North Vietnamese decided to attack in force, the odds would be overwhelmingly against them. The nearest major American base was Camp Carroll, 45 kilometers to the southeast, and relief forces would have to fight their way through heavily contested territory. The psychological pressure was immense. Radio intercepts suggested that the enemy commander, General von Nguyen Giap, the architect of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier, was personally overseeing the operation. The parallels were not lost on anyone. An isolated French garrison surrounded by Vietnamese forces had ended in catastrophic defeat and had ultimately led to France's withdrawal from Indochina. As afternoon approached, Lance Corporal Tommy Chen from 3rd Platoon noticed movement in the tree line, about 800 meters to the north. Through his binoculars, he could make out what appeared to be construction activity, bunkers being built, supply routes being established. The enemy was not hiding their preparations. They wanted the Americans to know they were there, to feel the weight of the noose tightening around their necks. The tension was palpable throughout the base as Marines went about their daily routines, with the knowledge that each day might be their last. Letters home took on a more urgent tone, and even the most hardened veterans found themselves checking their weapons more frequently, counting ammunition, and studying the maps of potential escape routes that everyone knew would be useless if the base was overrun. As the sun set on January 20th, painting the surrounding hills in shades of red that reminded too many Marines of blood, the waiting game continued. Tomorrow would bring either another day of nervous anticipation or the beginning of what many feared would be their final battle. The earth exploded at 5:30 in the morning on January 21st, 1968, as the first North Vietnamese rocket screamed into Sanh combat base. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was thrown from his bunk as the ammunition dump erupted in a chain of explosions that lit up the pre-dawn darkness like a deadly fireworks display. The siege of Sanh had begun. Colonel Lones rushed to the command bunker as reports flooded in from across the base. The initial barrage had been devastatingly accurate. The enemy had clearly spent months mapping every important target. The main ammunition depot was completely destroyed, sending secondary explosions rippling across the base for hours. The runway sustained multiple direct hits, temporarily cutting off the vital lifeline that kept the Marines supplied and connected to the outside world. Captain Wilkinson's Bravo Company took shelter in their reinforced bunkers as 130mm rockets and 82mm mortar rounds rained down. With methodical precision, the bombardment was unlike anything most of the Marines had experienced, sustained, accurate, and clearly the product of extensive planning and preparation. Through the chaos, radiomen desperately tried to maintain contact with headquarters in Da Nang and coordinate the base's response. The initial assault revealed the true scope of the enemy's preparations. Intelligence reports later confirmed by Newsweek's battlefield correspondents, indicated that the North Vietnamese had spent months moving heavy artillery pieces through the jungle, positioning them in caves and reinforced bunkers throughout the surrounding hills. Some of the weapons were Soviet-supplied rockets, capable of reaching every corner of the American base. As the bombardment continued into its second hour, Marine artillery began returning fire, guided by spotters who risked their lives to identify enemy positions. The 105mm howitzers of the 1st Battalion, 13th Marines, responded with counter-battery fire, but the enemy guns were well concealed and protected by natural rock formations that made them nearly impossible to silence. Lance Corporal Chen found himself trapped in a supply bunker with 5 other Marines when a direct hit collapsed part of the entrance. In the darkness, with dust and smoke choking their lungs, they worked frantically to clear the debris while listening to the ongoing battle above. The psychological impact of being buried alive, even temporarily, while under intense enemy fire, pushed several Marines to the edge of their mental endurance. The casualty reports began arriving at the command bunker as corpsmen worked to evacuate the wounded. 18 Marines had been killed in the initial barrage, with dozens more wounded. The medical facilities, already strained by previous skirmishes, were overwhelmed as stretcher bearers rushed casualties to the aid station while dodging ongoing rocket attacks. By mid-morning, the pattern of the siege became clear. This was not going to be a quick assault aimed at overrunning the base. Instead, the North Vietnamese intended to methodically destroy the American position. Through sustained bombardment while preventing resupply and reinforcement, the enemy had learned from previous battles and was applying siege tactics refined over centuries of warfare. Colonel Lones established communication with General William Westmoreland's headquarters in Saigon. Our EPO or TING that the base was under heavy attack, but holding firm. The strategic importance of Khe Sanh had suddenly escalated from a simple border outpost to a symbol of American determination in Vietnam. Losing the base would be both a tactical disaster and a propaganda victory for the North Vietnamese. That could not be allowed to happen. As afternoon approached, Marine F-4 Phantom jets arrived overhead, beginning what would become the largest sustained bombing campaign in support of a single battle. During the Vietnam War, Operation Niagara, as it was codenamed, would eventually drop over 100,000 tons of ordnance on the surrounding area. But on this first day, the airstrikes provided mainly psychological comfort to the besieged Marines. The first day of the siege ended with the base still in American hands, but the cost had been severe. The main runway remained unusable, forcing all resupply to depend on helicopter operations under fire. As darkness fell, every Marine at Khe Sanh understood that they had entered a fight that would test not only their tactical skills, but their very will to survive. By the morning of January 22nd, the Marines at Khe Sanh had settled into the grim rhythm of siege warfare. The North Vietnamese bombardment resumed before dawn, but this time the defenders were better prepared. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had reorganized his squad's positions during the night, creating better overhead cover and establishing alternate fighting positions that would allow them to continue operating even if their primary bunkers were destroyed. The true test came when enemy ground forces began probing the outer perimeter. Captain Wilkinson's Bravo Company faced the first serious ground assault around 0800 hours, where approximately 2 companies of North Vietnamese regulars emerged from the morning fog, advancing on the northeastern section of the wire. The Marines had prepared for this moment, with interlocking fields of fire from machine gun positions and pre-registered artillery concentrations covering all likely approaches. The firefight that followed lasted 3 hours and demonstrated both the determination of the attackers and the effectiveness of the Marines' defensive preparations. The enemy soldiers advanced with remarkable discipline, using small unit tactics that showed extensive training and preparation. They moved in coordinated waves, with supporting fire from mortars positioned in the surrounding hills, attempting to breach the perimeter wire at multiple points simultaneously. Lance Corporal Chen found himself manning an M60 machine gun position. That became crucial in repelling the assault. His team expended over 2,000 rounds of ammunition during the engagement, stopping several penetration attempts and inflicting heavy casualties on the advancing enemy forces. The intensity of the combat was unlike anything described in training. Continuous, close-range fighting where decisions made in split seconds determined who lived and who died. According to battlefield reports later published by the Washington Post, the Marines' defensive fire was devastating in its effectiveness. The combination of small arms fire, artillery support, and close air support created an impenetrable barrier that the North Vietnamese could not overcome, despite their numerical superiority and tactical surprise. However, the cost of the defenders was also significant, with Bravo Company suffering 12 casualties during the morning assault. Colonel Lones coordinated the base's response from his command bunker, which had been reinforced with additional sandbags and steel plating. After the previous day's bombardment, intelligence reports suggested that this first ground assault was merely a reconnaissance in force, designed to test the Marines' defenses and identify weak points for future attacks. The enemy's willingness to accept heavy casualties in exchange for tactical information indicated that much larger assaults were likely being planned. The resupply situation had become critical within 48 hours of the siege's beginning. With the runway still unusable due to enemy fire, all supplies had to be delivered by helicopter, a dangerous and inefficient process. CH-46C9 helicopters attempted supply runs during brief lulls in the bombardment, but many missions had to be aborted when enemy fire became too intense. The Marines were forced to carefully ration ammunition, food, and medical supplies while maintaining full combat readiness. The psychological pressure of the siege was beginning to affect every Marine on the base. The constant threat of sudden death from incoming rockets, combined with the knowledge that they were surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces, created a level of stress that tested even the most experienced veterans. Chaplain Ray Stubb moved continuously among the Marines, providing spiritual support and helping maintain morale during the darkest moments. By afternoon, Marine engineers had managed to make emergency repairs to a portion of the runway, allowing C-130 transport aircraft to attempt supply runs. Under extremely dangerous conditions, the pilots who volunteered for these missions became legends among the besieged Marines, landing under fire and taking off again within minutes, while enemy rockets exploded around their aircraft. As the second day of the siege ended, it became clear that both sides were settling in for a prolonged battle. The North Vietnamese had demonstrated their ability to sustain heavy bombardment and coordinate complex ground assaults, while the Marines had proven that Sanh would not fall easily. The stage was set for a battle of attrition that would test the limits of human endurance and military technology. The night brought no respite, as enemy sappers attempted to infiltrate the base perimeter under cover of darkness. Marines on watch duty faced the terrifying prospect of close combat in bunkers and trenches, where the advantage often went to the most ruthless and determined fighter. The morning of January 30th brought a new level of intensity to the siege. As the North Vietnamese launched their most coordinated assault yet, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez watched through his periscope as enemy forces moved with unprecedented organization across multiple sectors simultaneously. This was no longer a probing attack. It was a deliberate attempt to overrun the Marine positions before American reinforcements could arrive. The assault began with the heaviest artillery barrage since the siege started. Over 300 rounds struck the base in the first hour, targeting command bunkers, communication centers, and defensive positions with deadly accuracy. Captain Wilkinson's command post took a direct hit from a 130mm rocket, burying him and 3 Marines under tons of debris. It took 2 hours to dig them out, and Wilkinson suffered severe concussion and internal injuries that required immediate evacuation. Lance Corporal Chen had been promoted to squad leader after his sergeant was wounded in the previous day's fighting, and he found himself commanding 12 Marines in a desperate fight for survival. The enemy had managed to breach the outer wire into locations, and North Vietnamese soldiers were advancing through the minefield using Bangalore torpedoes to clear paths for the main assault force. The sound of explosions mixed with automatic weapons fire created a hellish symphony that could be heard for kilometers in every direction. The Marines' ammunition situation became critical during the sustained firefight. Chen's squad had expended most of their rifle ammunition and was down to their last belt for the machine gun when a resupply helicopter managed to land under fire. The crew chief and door gunners threw ammunition boxes toward the Marine positions while taking enemy fire, demonstrating the kind of courage under fire that would define the entire siege. According to contemporary reports from United Press international correspondents who witnessed the battle, the North Vietnamese assault represented one of the most sophisticated military operations conducted by enemy forces during the Vietnam War. The attackers used coordinated mortar fire, sapper teams, and infantry assaults to create multiple simultaneous crises that stretched the Marine defense to its breaking point. Colonel Lones made the difficult decision to call for Broken Arrow, the code phrase indicating that an American position was in immediate danger of being overrun. and requiring all available fire support regardless of proximity to friendly forces. Within minutes, every available artillery piece, fighter aircraft, and helicopter gunship in the region was converging on Sanh. The resulting bombardment was so intense that it could be felt at fire-base positions, over 50 kilometers away. The turning point came when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez led a desperate counterattack against North Vietnamese forces that had penetrated the inner perimeter, using grenades and close combat techniques. His squad fought room to room through bunker complexes that had been overrun by enemy soldiers. The combat was savage and personal, with Marines and North Vietnamese soldiers fighting hand-to-hand in conditions that resembled the worst battles of World War I. Medical Corpsman 3rd Class David Walsh worked throughout the assault to evacuate wounded Marines, while under continuous enemy fire. His actions during the 8-hour battle would later earn him the Navy Cross, as he repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to reach wounded Marines and carry them to safety. The aid station became overwhelmed with casualties, forcing corpsmen to perform life-saving surgery while rockets exploded nearby. The communication situation became desperate as multiple radio antennas were destroyed by enemy fire. Marines had to resort to runner messages between positions, with volunteers sprinting across open ground under fire to maintain coordination between defensive sectors. Several Marines were killed attempting to maintain communications, but their sacrifice ensured that defensive fire could be coordinated effectively. As evening approached, the North Vietnamese assault began to falter under the weight of concentrated American firepower. The combination of Marine small arms fire, artillery support, and continuous airstrikes had inflicted severe casualties on the attacking forces. Bodies of enemy soldiers lay scattered throughout the wire obstacles, testament to the ferocity of the day's fighting. The cost to the defenders had been severe. 43 Marines were killed during the assault, with over 100 wounded. Many defensive positions had been damaged or destroyed, requiring immediate reconstruction under the continuing threat of enemy bombardment. The Marines had held their positions, but everyone understood that similar assaults could be expected in the coming days. As darkness fell on January 30th, exhausted Marines worked to repair their defenses while listening to the sounds of enemy forces regrouping in the surrounding hills. The siege of Sanh had reached a critical juncture, and the outcome remained uncertain. February brought with it the monsoon rains and a new dimension of misery to the siege of Sanh. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez huddled in his flooded bunker, watching water drip through sandbags that had been soaked by weeks of continuous rain. The red clay had turned to thick mud that clung to everything and made movement between positions treacherous and exhausting. More importantly, the low ceiling created by the constant cloud cover limited air support and made resupply operations even more dangerous. The North Vietnamese had adapted their tactics to take advantage of the weather conditions. Artillery barrages now came at irregular intervals, often during periods of heavy rain when the sound of incoming rounds was masked by thunder and the noise of water cascading off bunker roofs. Lance Corporal Chen had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect the whistle of incoming rockets even through the storm, saving his squad's lives on multiple occasions by shouting warnings that sent Marines diving for cover. The psychological toll of the extended siege was becoming evident throughout the base. Captain Martinez, who had replaced the wounded Captain Wilkinson, reported increasing incidents of combat fatigue among his Marines. Men who had fought bravely for weeks were beginning to show signs of breakdown, uncontrollable shaking, inability to sleep, and in some cases, complete withdrawal from their surroundings. The base psychiatrist, Navy Lieutenant Commander Robert Johnson, worked continuously to identify and treat Marine suffering from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Food had become a critical issue as supply flights remained irregular due to weather and enemy fire. Marines were surviving on one meal per day, supplemented by whatever rations they had managed to save from better times. Water was abundant due to the rain, but purification tablets were running low, forcing the Marines to risk drinking untreated water that caused widespread dysentery and further weakened their ability to fight effectively. According to investigative reporting by the New York Times during the siege, the situation at Sanh had become a test of wills between American determination and North Vietnamese persistence. Both sides had committed enormous resources to the battle, and neither could afford to be seen as backing down. For the Americans, losing Sanh would represent a significant propaganda victory for the enemy. For the North Vietnamese, failing to take the base after such an enormous investment would be equally damaging to their cause. The enemy's tactics had evolved into a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare. Loudspeakers positioned in the surrounding hills broadcast propaganda messages in English, attempting to convince the Marines that they had been abandoned by their government and that surrender was their only option for survival. The messages were mixed with recordings of previous battles where American units had been overrun, creating an atmosphere of dread that was almost as effective as artillery bombardment. Medical Corpsman Walsh had been working without adequate sleep for over 2 weeks, treating an endless stream of casualties from both enemy action and the harsh living conditions. Trench foot, dysentery, and infected wounds were becoming as dangerous as enemy bullets. The aid station had run out of several critical medications, forcing corpsmen to make difficult decisions about which Marines could be treated and which would have to endure their suffering without medical intervention. Colonel Lones faced pressure from higher headquarters to maintain an aggressive defensive posture while conserving his dwindling resources. Intelligence reports suggested that the North Vietnamese were also suffering from the extended siege, with supply problems and casualties mounting among their forces as well. The question had become which side could endure the suffering longer, while maintaining the will to fight. The highlight of each day became the arrival of supply helicopters. During brief breaks in the weather, Marines would risk exposure to enemy fire to help unload ammunition, medical supplies, and the precious mail that provided their only connection to the world beyond the siege. Letters from home became more valuable than food, providing psychological sustenance that kept many Marines functioning. When physical exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them, engineering teams worked continuously to maintain the base's defensive positions. Despite the constant degradation caused by weather and enemy fire, bunkers collapsed regularly from the weight of water-soaked sandbags, requiring immediate reconstruction under dangerous conditions. The Marines had become expert at building effective fortifications using salvage materials, an ingenuity born of desperation. As February progressed, it became clear that the siege of Khe Sanh had become something more than a tactical battle. It had evolved into a symbol of American determination in Vietnam and a test of whether the United States military could withstand a prolonged siege by a determined enemy using conventional tactics. By mid-February, the strategic situation around Khe Sanh began to shift as massive American reinforcements moved into the region. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez could hear the distant thunder of B-52 bombers conducting around-the-clock strikes against suspected enemy positions in the surrounding mountains. Operation Niagara had escalated into the most intensive bombing campaign of the Vietnam War, with over 100,000 tons of ordnance being dropped on the area around the besieged base. The arrival of the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile at nearby positions marked the beginning of Operation Pegasus, the relief operation designed to break the siege permanently. Lance Corporal Chen watched from his bunker as helicopters from the 7th Cavalry began establishing landing zones within artillery range of Khe Sanh, bringing fresh troops and heavy equipment that would tip the balance of the battle decisively in favor of the Americans. Intelligence reports intercepted by Marine communications specialists revealed that the North Vietnamese forces were beginning to withdraw from their positions around the base. The sustained bombing campaign had disrupted their supply lines and inflicted casualties that made continuing the siege untenable. According to military analysts quoted in Stars and Stripes newspaper coverage of the battle, the enemy had achieved their primary objective of fixing American forces in place during the Tet Offensive, but could no longer sustain the losses required to capture the base. Captain Martinez coordinated with the relief forces as they advanced toward Khe Sanh. Along Route 9, the main highway that connected the base to the rest of South Vietnam, the advancing columns faced determined resistance from North Vietnamese rear guard units, but the combination of overwhelming firepower and fresh troops gradually cleared the road of obstacles and enemy positions. The psychological impact of knowing that relief was approaching transformed the mood. Within the besieged base, Marines who had endured weeks of constant bombardment and the threat of being overrun suddenly found new energy to repair defenses, care for wounded comrades, and maintain the equipment that had kept them alive throughout the siege. Medical Corpsman Walsh noted a dramatic improvement in the morale of wounded Marines who had been showing signs of giving up hope. The first convoy of relief supplies reached Khe Sanh on April 1st, 1968, officially ending the siege that had lasted 7 days. The Marines who had defended the base throughout the ordeal were overwhelmed by the sight of fresh troops, hot food, and medical supplies that represented their return to the land of the living. Many veterans of the siege would later describe this moment as one of the most emotional of their entire military service. Colonel Lones conducted a final inspection of the base's defenses, documenting the incredible ingenuity and determination that had allowed 6,000 Marines to withstand attack by overwhelming enemy forces for more than 2 months. The defensive position showed evidence of constant reconstruction and improvement, with elaborate tunnel systems, reinforced bunkers, and improvised weapons that demonstrated the resourcefulness of American forces under extreme pressure. The casualty statistics told the story of the siege's human cost. 205 Marines had been killed during the 7-to-7-day battle, with over 1,600 wounded. The North Vietnamese losses were estimated to be much higher, with intelligence reports suggesting over 10,000 casualties among the attacking forces. The siege had consumed enormous resources from both sides and had tested the limits of human endurance in modern warfare. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was among the Marines selected to remain at Sanh. As the base was reinforced and expanded following the siege, the experience had changed him profoundly, as it had all the survivors. The knowledge that they had faced overwhelming odds and survived created a bond among the defenders that would last for the rest of their lives. They had proven that American forces could withstand a sustained siege by a determined enemy and emerge victorious. The strategic implications of the successful defense of Sanh were significant for American strategy in Vietnam. The battle had demonstrated that conventional North Vietnamese forces could be defeated when confronted by determined American resistance and overwhelming firepower. However, it had also shown the enormous cost of maintaining isolated positions in enemy territory and the difficulty of achieving decisive victory in a guerrilla war. As the relief forces settled into permanent positions around the base, the Marines who had endured the siege began the process of returning to normal military operations. Many would be transferred to other units, carrying with them the lessons learned during their ordeal and the confidence that came from surviving one of the most intense battles of the Vietnam War. The evacuation of the original defenders began in early April, as fresh units took over the positions that had been held at such tremendous cost. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez packed his few remaining possessions, including letters from home that had sustained him through the darkest days of the siege. As his helicopter lifted off from the airstrip that had been rebuilt and expanded since the siege ended, he looked down at the scarred landscape that had been his world for over 3 months. Lance Corporal Chen had been recommended for the Silver Star for his leadership during the ground assaults that had nearly overrun the base. His transformation from a young Marine into a seasoned combat veteran was typical of many who had endured the siege. The experience had forced rapid maturation and had created skills and perspectives that would serve these Marines throughout their lives. Though many would struggle with the psychological aftermath for decades to come, the medical staff, led by Corpsman Walsh, had performed miracles under impossible conditions. Their casualty treatment and evacuation procedures developed during the siege would become standard practice for American forces throughout Vietnam. The lessons learned about treating combat fatigue and maintaining medical care under sustained enemy fire were incorporated into training programs that would save countless lives in future conflicts. Colonel Lone submitted his final report on the siege to Marine Corps headquarters, documenting the tactical innovations and defensive techniques that had made victory possible. His analysis emphasized the importance of pre-registered artillery fires, interlocking fields of defensive fire, and the morale factor that came from confident, experienced leadership under extreme pressure. The report became required reading at military academies and staff colleges around the world. The strategic debate about Sanh continued long after the last shots were fired. Critics argued that the base should never have been established in such an isolated position where it became a target for enemy forces and required enormous resources to defend. Supporters maintained that the successful defense had demonstrated American resolve and had prevented the North Vietnamese from achieving a propaganda victory that could have changed the course of the war. According to later historical analysis published by military historians, the siege of Sanh represented both the strengths and limitations of American military power in Vietnam. The successful defense showed that American forces could defeat conventional enemy attacks through superior firepower and tactical skill. However, the enormous cost in resources and personnel raised questions about the sustainability of such operations throughout the duration of a lengthy conflict. The human cost of the siege extended far beyond the casualty statistics. Many Marines who survived the battle struggled with survivor guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many of their comrades had died. Post-traumatic stress disorder, not yet fully understood by military medicine, affected a significant percentage of the survivors and would continue to impact their lives for decades after the war ended. The base at Sanh was eventually abandoned in June 1968, Just 2 months after the siege ended, the decision to withdraw from the position that had been defended at such tremendous cost was controversial and added to the ongoing debate about American strategy in Vietnam. Critics saw the abandonment as evidence that the entire siege had been pointless, while military leaders maintained that the base had served its purpose by tying down enemy forces. During the critical Tet period, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez returned to the United States in December 1968, carrying with him the memories of friends lost and battles won. Like many Vietnam veterans, he found the transition to civilian life difficult, as few people could understand the intensity of the experiences he had endured. The siege of Khe Sanh had become a defining moment in his life, one that would influence every decision he made in the years that followed. The legacy of Khe Sanh extended beyond the immediate participants. It influenced American military doctrine and strategy for generations. The lessons learned about defensive operations, logistics under fire, and the psychological factors that determine victory or defeat in prolonged combat became part of the institutional memory of the United States Marine Corps. The courage and determination displayed by the defenders became legendary within the military community and served as inspiration for future generations of Marines facing their own battles in distant lands today. The site of Khe Sanh Combat Base is marked by a simple memorial that honors both the American Marines who defended it and the North Vietnamese soldiers who attacked it. The red clay hills that once echoed with the sounds of battle now grow coffee and vegetables, testament to the resilience of life even in places where death once seemed to reign supreme. The Siege of Khe Sanh remains one of the most studied battles in military history, a 7-to-7-day test of human courage that demonstrated both the horror and heroism that defined combat in any era.